Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Science Friday live stream for the book club. I am so excited to be here with you tonight. My name is Diana Plasker. I am the Experiences Manager and Book Club Captain for Science Friday. So I'm joining you from very rainy, snowy, then rainy upstate New York this week. It's a very weird week to be almost at winter time, but I'm excited to chat with you all, no matter where you are joining us from. Speaking of which, I want to know, where are you joining us from? A few people have already started to let us know in the chat. You do have to sign into YouTube with a Google account in order to add your voice to our chat. So you can go ahead and do that at any time. But we've got some people from joining from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Hampshire, Oregon, Cincinnati, Ohio, North Carolina, Bozeman, Montana. Thank you all so much. Keep letting us know where you are joining us from the chat. And well, if you don't know Science Friday, I like to say that we are your one-stop shop for all things science news. You can find everything about us on our website, sciencefriday.com, including, the thing we're probably best known for, our weekly radio show at every Friday, you guessed it, 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. You can listen live on your local NPR station, but also on our website. Well, if you don't know the book club, we read a new science-related read every single month. And this month, we're talking about our last pick of the year, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet by Ben Goldfarb. And if you want to join fellow readers to discuss this and our other book club picks, you can do that at our community space, which is great. It's a fantastic place. It is a lovely community. And I'm going to post the link for it in the chat, so you can join us right after this live stream. I recognize many of the names from our community space here in the chat tonight. So thank you again for joining us. Well, a kind reminder before we get started: Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender, and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origin, and any other dimension of diversity. We've created a code of conduct, which you can read in its entirety on our community space when you join us on Mighty Networks. But here are the basics. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another and asking questions in the chat tonight. Share generously and listen closely. You can add your thoughts whenever in the chat, even if they aren't strictly questions for our guest. We're going to do our best to stay on topic tonight, as we're here to discuss this month's book club pick and closely related topics. And we do reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in the chat tonight. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for sticking with me. I think it is time for me to bring on our extremely special guest. So please, in the chat, a big round of applause for our guest, Ben Goldfarb. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Diana. How's it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to quickly introduce you. So Ben Goldfarb is a conservation journalist and author. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Science, The New York Times, and many more publications. Ben is the author of this month's Sci-Fi Book Club pick, which again is Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. Thank you again so much for being here tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for choosing this book, and thanks to everyone out there who read and engaged with it this month. I so appreciate everyone who's in the chat. Some names familiar to me, some who are actually involved in this book in various ways, I think. So I really appreciate all of you tuning in and again engaging with the work. It means a lot to me.
Hey, I love that. That's amazing. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. So we're going to dive right in. We're going to wait for questions from our audience to come on in. But Ben, of course, I have some questions for you. So can you start by just giving us the Crossings elevator pitch? What is the book about, and why did you decide to write it?
Sure. So the book is about road ecology, which is this relatively small but fast-growing field of science. It looks at all of the different ways that roads and nature interact, from the most obvious conspicuous effect, which is roadkill, right? We've all seen the carcass by the side of the highway, to the impacts of noise pollution on wildlife, to road salt runoff, to the barrier effect created by traffic that fragments ecosystems and prevents wildlife from completing their migration. And of course, roads impact us humans in all kinds of ways too. Roads fragment communities, and noise pollution is literally killing us, as well as air pollution. And so road ecology is basically this, again, this field of science that looks at all of those different connections and relationships, and I think really importantly, says, okay, what do we do about the problems that roads create, both for wildlife and nature and for human communities as well. So that's what the book's about, is road ecology and why it's such a vital science in 2024.
How did you first learn about road ecology? I wonder if you're like me. I started reading the book and I was like, that sounds like something I want to do. I wish I could go back to school and become a road ecologist. But were you immediately intrigued, or did it take you a while for like the sort of excitement to be sparked?
Well, I think I was immediately intrigued, but it definitely took years for the book to gestate. As I write in the introduction, my first kind of the seminal experience for me that so inspired my fascination in this topic was in 2013. I was in Montana writing about wildlife conservation. I'm a conservation journalist, really. And I had a chance to take a tour of some wildlife crossings that had been built on Highway 93 on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes' land north of Missoula. And the tribes had basically insisted that the state of Montana and the federal government include these underpasses and an overpass with this big reconstruction of the highway in the early 2000s. And these crossings had been used, they have been used hundreds of thousands of times by bears and elk and deer and all kinds of critters. And so in 2013, I had a chance to take a tour of these crossings and actually stood on top of one of these wildlife bridges. And it was just incredibly inspiring, exciting. We do so much on this planet to make animals' lives harder and more dangerous. And here was this multi-million-dollar piece of infrastructure we built to make their lives a little bit safer and easier. And so that just, that notion that infrastructure could be this kind of form of ecological empathy or compassion really excited me. And then, some years went by. I kept writing about the topic of roads and wildlife as a journalist, and eventually, starting in 2019, I really began working on this book.
What did you find when you went on top of that crossings? Was there anything like really surprising that even now, when you think back to that memory, that stands out to you?
I think the thing that was so interesting about it to me was, look, these wildlife crossings get used by all kinds of different critters, right? There are bears and elk and moose, the big kind of charismatic animals. But then there are also bobcats and mink and meadow voles, and mice and all kinds of smaller creatures as well. And so I was up there with a guy named Marcel Hauser, who's a road ecologist, and self-described as that, a decade ago, back when not many people used that title. And he was pointing out all of these little features and tweaks that he wanted to see employed to make this wildlife crossing more functional. Hey, if we added this sort of visual screen of vegetation along the side of the bridge, we could block headlights, and that might prevent light pollution from disrupting animal movements. And if we put little brush piles here and there along the deck of the bridge, we could create some micro habitat for voles and mice and other rodents. So that idea about thinking about how every different member of the ecological community encounters these structures and uses them and experiences them, that was what I think fired my imagination.
Well, so you talked a little bit about the obvious ways that roads are bad for humans as well as animals. In terms of our relationship with animals, roadkill, it wasn't immediately following the ubiquity of cars, but it didn't take too long for that word to be invented. But there are other ways that roads affect wildlife. Can you tell us about those sort of sneakier ways that roads are affecting the world around them?
Yeah, I think a lot about the barrier effect, right? So, imagine being a deer or a bear or any critter approaching a big interstate, I-80 or I-70 here in Colorado, where I live. Right? I mean, there's just this steady wall of traffic rolling along these busy highways, and it's basically impossible even to attempt to cross. Right? Lots of busy freeways actually don't have much roadkill because animals never even try to dart through traffic. And so that fragmentation, that habitat fragmentation that barrier effect can impose, at times is even more disastrous than roadkill for some wildlife. One of the places I went in this book was Southwest Wyoming, the Red Desert, where there's this famous herd of mule deer who migrate through Wyoming, and the southern end of their winter range is I-80, and in harsh winters they'll kind of pool up on the north side of that highway looking for a gap in traffic to run across and get to that good habitat south of the highway, and they just can't find a way through traffic. And so not many of them actually get killed, but in some especially harsh winters, 40% of that herd will actually starve because they can't reach all of that good habitat south of the highway, right? So in some ways that's worse than roadkill itself. A herd of deer could handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that habitat.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was surprised when I was reading your book was, when some of the people were originally trying to fund these crossings and other solutions for, management, ecology management around roads, the first ways they did it was by sort of pointing out all the costs of all the federal and state costs that were sort of piling up because of wildlife, coming onto our roads. It was hospital bills and car detailing, and all of these things could save us X amount of millions of dollars per year if we were to have, 95% fewer crashes. But that
Right.
also set up a kind of like instance where you have to prove the monetary value of these things in order to get them funded. But what about, you know, amphibians?
Right.
Like these animals that like we just want them to live. We don't necessarily, there's not really a cost that we might think about except the fact that the cost of losing these animals. That was an interesting sort of thing that I didn't expect to learn as part of your book and really took me by surprise.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and I'm glad you took that from the book, because it's true that, look, I mean, obviously hitting animals, large animals, is really dangerous, right? I mean, it costs us billions of dollars every year in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and so on. The single most dangerous wild animal in North America is the white-tailed deer, right? It's not the deer's fault, obviously. It's automotive society's fault, but I mean, I think that just goes to show how problematic these collisions are. And so you're right that transportation departments, especially in Western states, have done a lot, or at least a fair amount. Could certainly do more to build these wildlife crossings and fences that allow deer and elk and antelope and other large critters to move safely back and forth without getting in these collisions. But because, as you say, we're focused on preventing crashes involving large animals, we don't really think much about, right, the frogs, the salamanders, the turtles, all of those smaller, less charismatic, or at least less sort of conventionally charismatic animals that are not dangerous to driver safety, but are hugely threatened by vehicles. I mean, I think that frogs and salamanders and toads, amphibians, are probably the most road endangered taxonomic group on Earth. These are animals that are migrating from their upland sort of overwinter habitat down to breeding wetlands, and typically we have roads between those two habitats, and so they're at enormous risk of being crushed. And so, yeah, let's build more passages for deer and elk and bears and other big animals, but let's spare thought for the smaller creatures as well.
Speaking of which, while we're talking about the frogs, Yvette sent us a question in advance, which reads, your chapters about amphibians and reptiles were eye-opening. Is there hope of developing a functional underpass, or will physical transportation be a constant volunteer project? So talk to us a little bit about like how these underpasses sort of work and how they were developed, and whether or not sort of volunteers literally picking up toads, putting them into buckets and carrying them across the roads might just be the way to do it for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, certainly other countries do have lots of amphibian underpasses. I write about tow tunnels in the UK, in Germany, in Switzerland, and other Western European countries where these amphibian passages, just little miniature underpasses, are kind of a widespread and highly effective solution. In the US, we haven't done a whole lot of that. There are a few out there. There's a salamander tunnel in Amherst, Massachusetts. There's an amphibian culvert in Moncton, Vermont, that was built, I think, in 2016. There are some great turtle tunnels in Florida, so they're out there. But certainly there are many fewer than there should be. And again, I think that has to do with sort of the lack of driver safety connection here, right? I mean, typically when one of the interesting things about wildlife crossings for deer and other big animals is that they're actually very nonpartisan, right? There are plenty of Republicans who support building more infrastructure for passing large critters, but when you start talking about spending a couple $1 million on a frog tunnel, that's when the fiscal conservatives come out of the woodwork and say, really, we're going to spend $2 million helping turtles cross a highway? That seems crazy. So I think we just need to expand our circle of concern and recognize that, hey, these smaller animals too are deserving of our time and attention and funding.
Yeah, it was so surprising. I was surprised by so many of the chapters, and I didn't expect a whole chapter about frogs and amphibians to really sort of strike my imagination, but great job. It really did. We've got such great questions from our audience already, so I'm gonna kick to a couple of them. We've got Brady, whose question is, in your opinion, what species is most at risk of extinction because of roads? This is a tough one. I mean, you have a whole chapter about insects too. So sometimes it's some of the smallest creatures that you might not expect.
Yeah, I think my default is actually to those larger animals, right? I really think about the large carnivores. Somebody else in the chat mentioned Florida panthers. I think about Florida panthers, Asiatic cheetahs, ocelots, maned wolves in Brazil. Right? I mean, the thing about carnivores is that first they tend to be relatively rare, compared to herbivores. So if you lose a few breeding females, that's really problematic. And also they have large territories, right? They're patrolling these big areas, and if you're walking around a lot, odds are, in the 21st century, you're crossing a lot of roads, right? So these are animals that are exposed to roads. They're really vulnerable to habitat fragmentation, and they're relatively rare on the landscape. So I think about those large carnivores as being the most road-threatened organisms out there, along with those amphibians that we talked about earlier.
You had a whole chapter about the mountain lions in the LA sort of area, and in particular P22, which sort of a male mountain goat that sort of sparked the imaginations of people in the LA area. That's another instance too of particular animals having to sort of become like poster children almost for these passes. Do you think a lot of times that those kinds of things, like specific animals, are more likely to become in the future kind of like poster children for these passes in some way? Or do you think that hopefully we'll sort of come together to support these things from the human side of things?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that that certainly the existence of P22, right? This incredibly famous, beloved mountain lion. I mean, that was, unbelievably galvanizing in LA to get this wildlife overpass built at Liberty Canyon. It's going to allow these two, or a number of really mountain lion populations, to kind of meet and mingle and exchange their genes, right? And P22 was, he was this very famous mountain lion who kind of escaped from this little island of habitat and crossed a couple of the busiest freeways on Earth and ended up stranded in this in Griffith Park, this little urban park. The smallest known range of any mountain lion. He was surrounded by freeways, and he never managed to find a mate because no other mountain lion could repeat his journey. So he was this very, as you say, tangible, sympathetic symbol for everything that that mountain lions are up against. All kinds of critters are up against, including us humans, right? That's one of the points that I try to make very explicitly in this book, is that we're all kind of in it together, right? Anybody who lives in LA or any other sort of freeway dependent city in the country, knows what it's like to be stuck in traffic and have their community fragmented by highways. And so I think we can make a lot of progress by empathizing with these animals and recognizing that, hey, the ways in which roads affect quote unquote wild ecosystems and the ways they affect human communities are actually really closely linked and analogous. And in LA, there were people in in communities of color, neighborhoods of color, who wrote hip hop songs about P22 because they recognized that again the same freeways that were preventing him from finding a mate had also just it really impacted their own communities. And so that kind of interspecies empathy is really what I was hoping to foster in this book.
Yeah, I love that. Such good questions from our audience. Let's see. We've got one from Dale that reads, how do the prospects for continued federal funding for wildlife infrastructure look now? So this book is still fairly new. You published it in 2022. Is that right?
2023. Yeah.
2023. Thank you. I don't even know what year it is anymore.
Me neither.
And so, but
it's about to change too. That makes it really confusing.
I know. Yeah, it's not great, but yeah. So it's still pretty. So you've included as much as you possibly can on the sort of current state of affairs. But in the last few years, has anything changed in terms of federal funding, or sort of what are you expecting in the coming years?
Yeah, the big federal development is something called the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, which is this big pot of money that was included in the 2021 Infrastructure Act, which basically allocates $350 million in competitive grant funding for new wildlife crossings to states and tribes and other eligible entities. And so some of that money has gone out the door already, which is exciting. I think that DOT is going to announce another round of funding pretty soon here, and it'll be exciting to see what projects get chosen for that. So look, on one hand, that's really exciting, right? $350 million, that sounds like a lot of money. That's good. It's certainly a bigger pot of funding, than we've ever allotted for this issue before. On the other hand, the State Infrastructure Act also included $100 billion, billion with a B, for new highway widening and expansion projects that are going to, make all of this work, right? So, on one hand, yes, we're allocating more money to this issue. On the other hand, where you could certainly argue, and I do argue that we're not allocating nearly enough. And of course, what's going to happen to that funding going forward is the big question under the Trump administration. I don't know. I think that from a cost benefit standpoint, I think that the Department of Government Efficiency, should definitely approve more wildlife crossings. But who knows what's going to happen? I mean, I do again think that one of the nice things about this issue is that it is pretty nonpartisan, right? That some of the the politicians who wrote the language that created the original Wildlife Crossings pilot program, there were Republicans involved in that. John Barrasso from Wyoming, for example. So here in Colorado, 85% of residents support more wildlife crossings. Right? This is truly this issue that transcends party divides. And so in that sense, I'm hopeful that this pot of funding, this wildlife crossings program is going to continue and be renewed, maybe even at a higher funding level going forward. That would be great. But all bets are off for the next 4 years, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if there were any particular wildlife crossings or other solutions that you were just really delighted by that sort of stick with you even now, having published this book a year ago. If there are any that you're just like, gosh, that one's great. I mean, you also have been keeping up with some of the things that have been happening in the last few years, and you recently saw a crossing that was specifically designed for tarantulas. So I just wonder if there were any that were just like, oh, that's so cool, and you were just so excited about it.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was most excited about, that I am most excited about, it's not even wildlife related exactly, but toward the end of the book, I really try to dive into the impacts of highways on human communities, and one of and I mean there are lots of cities, right? Milwaukee, Rochester, Oakland, that actually demolished these urban freeways that were built in the mid 20th century, often cases really with kind of racist intent, right? These freeways that were put in, specifically to kind of plow through communities of color and displace neighborhoods that white urban officials considered slums wrongly. And so, it's just incredibly exciting to see cities start to demolish some of those freeways. And, one of the places I went was Syracuse, New York, where I-81 is, this giant kind of monolithic viaduct that plows through the middle of the city. And, historically, really just devastated the 15th ward, the city's biggest Black community. And now the city is kind of in the process of removing that viaduct, or at least figuring out how that's going to work and what's going to replace it, and what sorts of neighborhoods and small businesses and so on are going to go into that kind of at grade street level boulevard that will eventually replace this freeway viaduct. And so that sort of thing, ultimately, wildlife crossings and other retrofits are nice, but I'm just so inspired by the idea of removing highways altogether. Taking these kind of legacy mistakes that we made, before we before we recognized fully just how catastrophic they were, and undoing that damage and kind of reversing course. So I find that freeway removal to be the really the most exciting thing going in the infrastructure world, I think.
Yeah, we'll just diminish the amount of roads we have, and maybe there will be better solutions for all kinds of problems. I love that. You talk a lot in there's a beginning of part 2, you talk about the Forest Service and the national parks and the way that the roads that are just scattered throughout these landscapes are affecting wildlife in places that we think of as wild as could possibly be, but literally have roads all over them. Was that a surprise to you when you were doing your research, how many roads are in these spaces? Or was it just sort of following a idea that you were pretty sure was true and sort of fleshing it out as part of these chapters?
Oh, I mean, it's being out in many of these densely roaded national forests is just stunning. It's shocking. I mean, it's like national, like when you look at a zoomed out map of North America, right? Our national forests, these big spaces, primarily in the American West, right? They're these big green blocks that look like, right, intact, beautiful habitat that must be full of grizzly bears and wolverines and all kinds of awesome animals. And then in some of these places, you're actually out there on the landscape and realize, oh, these things are just absolutely spiderwebbed with logging roads, from the early to mid 20th century. I mean, there were national forests, in Idaho and Western Montana that have higher road densities than New York City, because I mean, again, logging industry just went in there, and as one person joked to me, it seems like they drove to every single tree, right? They just built these incredibly expensive networks of logging roads to get timber out, and these are roads that see very little traffic, right? They're dirt roads in the middle of nowhere. There's not a whole lot of roadkill or noise pollution out there. It's not like I-80 or the 101 in California. But they still have really significant impacts, right? You get a big snowmelt event or a rainstorm, and these dirt roads just turn liquid, and all of that sediment bleeds into streams and smothers fish eggs or amphibian larvae. They're triggering landslides, and they're providing access to human beings, right? And for so many sort of sensitive, shy animals, from grizzly bears to lynx to even elk, they understand that humans are dangerous, and if lots of people are using these dirt roads to enter nature, that can be a kind of a problem for habitat security for these critters. And so one of the things I write about in the book is the idea of road decommissioning and obliteration, right? Get back there with some heavy machinery and tear these roads up and basically return them to nature. And so, I love that idea too, right? That road removal can really occur at multiple scales. You've got these little tiny roads, these little dirt roads in our national forest that we're taking out. And then you've got, these giant urban freeways like I-81 in Syracuse that we're also capable of taking out. So two ends of the road spectrum, but in both cases, again, these legacy mistakes aren't necessarily permanent.
Well, Sheldon has a great question sort of on the tail of that about hiking trails. So he asked, do hiking trails like the Appalachian Trail, for example, present the same challenges to some animals as roads do?
Yeah, they certainly do. I mean, I think that, in some ways, the next kind of frontier, the next ecological frontier, this sort of sister science to road ecology is recreation ecology, right? Studying and understanding how human beings and just our presence in nature impacts wildlife. And what we know is that we're incredibly disruptive, right? There have been studies showing that, of course, animals avoid popular hiking and mountain biking trails, and that they become more nocturnal in places where there are lots of hikers. That even seemingly benign activities like cross-country skiing, can actually be really, really disruptive. And of course, there's a huge challenge there, right? Of course, we all want to get out into nature. I love being outside and hiking and fishing and camping and doing all the fun stuff in the outdoors. That's a big part of, why my wife and I live in Colorado, right? But we also recognize that our presence out there is inherently disruptive. So how do we get people into nature for all of its sort of soul restoring and physical benefits, while minimizing our impacts on the animals who rely on nature as their homes? I think that's one of the next great challenges in land management. And I'd love to see more kind of seasonal closures. In the town where I live, we have areas that are closed to mountain biking for deer overwintering habitat or bighorn sheep habitat. So that sort of thing where you're sort of removing or lightening human presence on certain landscapes at certain times of year, in ways that are sensitive to the animals that are spatially using that habitat at different times. I think that's really the kind of the future of land and wildlife and recreation management.
Speaking of sort of like changing our sort of like thoughts about some of these animals and our access to them, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife just like announced this last week, actually, that they're proposing to list the monarch butterflies as threatened under the Endangered Species Act due to the declining populations. How could that decision affect plans to create highway roadside gardens and other habitats for migrating insects? You talk a little bit about those plans in your books, and how do you think that them being listed as threatened, would affect those plans in other ways that we try to protect monarchs?
Yeah, it's a really a great question. And look, I mean, roads are kind of this double-edged sword for monarch butterflies, right? Yes, they are potentially habitat. The Midwest, where monarchs migrate, it's this kind of corn and soy and lawn monoculture, right? And those roadside strips of prairie are some of the last reserves of milkweed and other important nectar plants. And so we know that lots of butterflies do lay eggs along roadside habitats. I went to Minnesota and working on this book, and saw them doing exactly that. And it was kind of terrifying, but also thrilling to watch these fragile butterflies bobbing through traffic, looking for a place to lay their eggs. So we know that roadsides can be habitat, but we also know that, of course, they're very dangerous habitat, right? And millions of butterflies are killed, every year during the course of their migration, from the upper Midwest to Mexico. And so, I think the big challenge in this, and I certainly hope that, a potential listing galvanizes more research on this issue is, okay, we know that they're going to be using these roadsides. How do we make roadsides better habitat, right? Maybe that means, different mowing schedules so that we're mowing in ways that promote, young, tender milkweed when monarch caterpillars need it most. Maybe, it means it's sort of elevating the roadside habitat, like building berms, that we plant so the butterflies are flying over traffic rather than through traffic. I've heard that idea raised as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough one because we're obviously, not going to shut down traffic on I-35, which basically parallels the monarch migration through the Midwest to avoid taking a federally threatened species. But we really need to figure out ways to manage these roadside habitats that butterflies are inevitably going to use, in ways that maximize their productivity while minimizing the risks they're posing.
Yeah. Yeah, I was so really taken by that chapter because you described, like you said, you described these butterflies just like kind of like dodging traffic that they kind of like might not even really be able to perceive and sort of like flipping around. And I was just like, I'm like thinking about all the times I've driven that I just probably haven't even noticed all of the bugs that are just avoiding me. Certainly notice, as you mentioned, the sort of windshield effect, this phenomenon that as we've gone on in the years, there's just been way fewer insects that are sort of smacking into our windshields, and it's because of the huge decline, not just because of cars, but probably a bit because of cars, like massively declining insect species. So it's so interesting just the way that all of these things sort of come together, and cars and roads are playing a big part in these things.
Yeah, they're playing a big part, and I mean, as that kind of windshield phenomenon attests, right? They're also part of how we understand the world. We experience nature from our cars in a lot of respects, and roadkill is also this potential scientific resource, right? It's this, one paper I cite in the book, sort of analogizes roadkill to camera traps, this sort of sampling system that's constantly recording everything that crosses its path. And there have been, literally hundreds of scientific papers, wildlife biology papers that have relied on roadkill as this data source, this resource for discovery about the range expansion of certain species, or the entry of non-native species into ecosystems, or the northward shifting of species with climate change. And so in some ways, I think, of course, roadkill is a tragedy that we're obliged to mitigate and prevent as much as possible. But if it is occurring, it's also this resource that lots of scientists have taken advantage of.
Yeah, scientists are going to science no matter what the science is.
Exactly. So. Yeah, that's Science Friday's whole ethos, right?
Yeah, for sure. We will find them and talk to them. So
yeah.
We've got a great question from Paige that reads: you approached this with such curiosity that the tone of your book balances optimism with some of the tough statistics, but it's easy for the topic itself to feel quite bleak. Was that difficult to balance as part of your writing?
Yeah, that's a nice question, Paige, and certainly something that I thought about a lot. I think like a lot of sort of nature-loving people on this call, probably. I oscillate wildly between hope and despair, and you never quite know what you're gonna feel on a given day. I think that I did think a lot about what Paige was asking about, which is, okay, if the subject matter is going to be dark and sad and challenging at times, how do I keep the prose, the sentences themselves, relatively light and snappy and hopefully humorous at times when it's warranted? I think I think you can feed your audience a lot of dark subject matter and statistics if the tone of your prose, as Paige points out, is sort of sufficiently light and buoyant. And so that sort of mediating the light and the dark is something I definitely did consider, and I'm glad that it's working for Paige.
Yeah, it's such a fun book to read. I was just telling you before we started this, that this is the second time I'm fully reading through the book. And I'm just like, the prose is so fun, and you really do make road ecology feel like a topic that I wish I had gone back to school to do. But I do feel like that about a lot of the books I read. So your writing, it really invited me to sort of imagine my life as a road ecologist. Well, we've got another great question from Brady that reads, do you think expansion of public transit can help solve this issue? This is very close to my heart, so I'm very curious about your thoughts about road ecology plus public transit.
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly I'm absolutely a supporter of more transit and in more walkable, bikeable, pedestrian-friendly communities and cities. Anything we can do to reduce the number of cars on the road, I think, is really important. I mean, I think that Brady's. I mean, it's interesting to think about like Brady's phrasing of the question, right? Can it solve the issue or help solve the issue? And there, I think, unfortunately, the answer is probably not. It can help address the issue. Again, anything we do to reduce the number of cars out there is important. But there is this spatial mismatch, I think, between where public transit is going to be the most beneficial and where it's most sort of applicable, and where road ecology problems are occurring, right? And by that, I mean, most of the animals are out in the rural areas, right? At least most of the big animals. Yes, there are plenty of suburban white-tailed deer out here, but like in my little very rural corner of Colorado, this is where we have the big migrating herds of mule deer and elk and antelope and moose. We've got all of these creatures, and we're 20 miles from the nearest town in our town, right? Yes, it would be great to have more bus transit between us and neighboring communities, but ultimately, it's just hard to imagine the public transit that is going to completely replace the role of the automobile in rural Colorado, right? So that's where those wildlife crossings and other passages come in is in those I mean, large and not exclusively, right? There are plenty of urban wildlife crossings out there like that, the one for mountain lions outside of LA. But I think that in a lot of ways, wildlife crossings are most applicable in these rural places where we have large movements of wildlife coinciding with rural highways with a fair amount of car traffic. And so that's kind of my mantra is let's see a lot more transit, walkability, bikeability in the urban and suburban areas, and in these rural places. That's where the wildlife crossings really come in, because again, those are the places that are hard to service by transit and have large wildlife populations.
And to be fair, this isn't the same, but you do write in your book about the Alaska National Park that has sort of basically said, like, you can't have a car in here, and we're gonna essentially have mandated buses that can only go at a certain amount of time, and it's for those sheep over there and other animals, but like, we got to protect those sheep. And I love that solution. I did love that there are some places that can sort of limit the amount of cars or limit the roads and sort of put in place these rules to protect the wildlife that they're sort of helping protect. And it's like a really beautiful solution.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's kind of one of the crazy things about our quote unquote protected areas, right? Think about a national park like Yosemite or Yellowstone. These are places where wildlife, they're safe from hunting, they're safe from development, they're safe from all of these anthropogenic pressures, but they're not safe from cars, right? We have this automotive model of national park tourism. The iconic American road trip is to drive through a Western national park, right? And so we've fundamentally made our, again, quote unquote protected areas really dangerous for wildlife in a lot of ways. And so it's exciting to see places like Denali National Park, which I write about in the book, and Zion National Park in Utah, and to some extent Glacier. There are a number of parks that are rethinking the classic private automobile tourism approach and are routing visitors onto shuttles. And I absolutely I support that. I think that, I think that every major, Western national park should be, on a shuttle system, basically, because, again, these places are kind of protected areas in name only, in a lot of ways, because we're driving through them.
Yeah. You met a lot of people who work in road ecology or are adjacent to road ecology, like Beth Pratt, who helped fund the 101
Yeah.
overpass with, private money.
Right.
Mike Dombreck, the Forest Service road dismantler, and
Yeah.
William Clark, the Denali Road Ecology Program Manager. All of these people had such different jobs, different roles and responsibilities. But what was one unifying quality of those people that you found as you were speaking to them for your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, like, certainly tirelessness, right, is a big one. I mean, I'm not sure when Beth Pratt sleeps, between all of her, her writing and fundraising and campaigning, and public speaking, and I think, look, also just, a sort of optimism that change is possible, right? I think that one of the challenges about working on transportation is that it can feel impossible in a lot of ways. There are these giant, literally concrete structures out there that just feel so immovable, and intractable. And so the optimism and capacity for hope that it takes to look at the 101, a 10-lane freeway, and say, you know what, I bet we can build a bridge for mountain lions over that thing, or to look at I-81 in Syracuse and say, you know what, this sun-blotting viaduct that's been up there for my entire life, I think we can get that out of there. That capacity to believe in change, in the change of our physical world, the retrofitting and dismantling of our physical infrastructure. I mean, again, it just seems so permanent and unchangeable. When you look at something like an interstate highway, and yet, a lot of the people I met just had the ability to look beyond that and see something else.
Yeah, they were really, I enjoyed reading about them as much as I enjoyed reading about the structures and the solutions that they were coming up with. So, well, we've got a great question. I think this is the last audience question that we'll have time to take, but Linda has a really interesting question about the role of technology. So they write, I'm catching up on the reading, but how is technology, GPS, for instance, helping with letting drivers know the presence of animal on the road so they can slow down? You talk a little bit about how deer crossing signs eventually just become kind of like part of the road. We don't really see them, and we slow down a massive 2 miles per hour when we see a crossings sign.
Right.
So they're not really doing great work, but is technology possibly something that we can use to help people slow down or know where animals might be?
Yeah, there's certainly there are these systems called animal detection systems out there, that have some benefits. So as you say, the issue with the standard yellow diamond, the deer crossing sign, is that we just habituate to it, right? We tune it out; it becomes white noise. Whereas animal detection systems are basically responsive in real time. They're essentially these radar and camera systems that detect animals as they approach the highway, and they light the sign up only when an animal is actually approaching the road, and so that in that way, they prevent driver habituation, because if you see the sign lit up, there's a deer there, right? And so those systems are somewhat effective. Better than nothing. They are kind of expensive and hard to maintain. When I think about how sort of vehicular technology will affect drivers and wildlife moving forward. Of course, I think about self-driving cars, right? What are autonomous vehicles, going to mean for this issue? And I think that's again another really double-edged sword in a lot of ways. Yes, we know that ultimately, I do really believe that autonomous vehicles are going to be exceptionally good at detecting and avoiding large animals. I think and who knows what time scale this is going to happen on, right? But someday, I do think that deer and elk and bear collisions, are going to be not a thing of the past, but certainly dramatically reduced. The issue, of course, is that right now, car companies developing autonomous vehicles are, basically their sensors are designed to detect and brake for objects toddler-sized or larger, right? And so, that's good news if you're a moose, but not good news if you're a frog or a turtle or any smaller critter, right? And so you could really imagine a world in which self-driving cars leads to more small animal roadkill. I personally brake for snakes, and a lot of people I know do, but my robotic chauffeur is not going to, right? And I think that the larger issue is that if you look at any transportation modeling study, we know that autonomy is going to lead to more cars on the road, right? If it's no longer such a big hassle to drive because you can sit in the back of your self-driving car and watch Netflix while the robot drives you around, you're going to end up driving more and spending more time in cars. We're already seeing, more deliveries, and eventually those are all going to be autonomous, right? And so, basically any transportation modeling study you look at says there are going to be more cars on the road, and that's just going to be worse for that barrier effect we talked about earlier, right? This dense wall of traffic that prevents animals from moving around. So, maybe autonomy is going to be good ultimately for deer vehicle collision reduction, but I actually don't think it's going to be fantastic news for wildlife generally.
Yeah, I think your instincts are right there. Yeah, it seems like we brake for snakes, but the robot inside of my computer probably doesn't care much for snakes. Yeah.
Right.
Ben, well, we're coming to the end of our time together. I'm curious if people are looking for overpasses, underpasses, other solutions for wildlife crossings in their area. Some of them are pretty sneaky. And so I'm wondering, like, how might they identify one if its job is just to kind of fade into the background and only be effective for, a salamander or a very specific kind of deer in their local area?
Yeah, so one of the really important things about wildlife crossings is that they don't work in isolation, right? You really need roadside fences to funnel the animals to the crossing, right? People always say, how do the animals know to use the crossing? And the answer is that you fence off the roadside, and that deer or elk, hits the fence line, paces it for a quarter mile, and then finds the underpass or overpass, right? So if you see a lot of roadside fencing, that can be a pretty good indication. Typically you're looking for 8-foot high page wire fencing. If you just see a few strands of barbed wire by the side of the highway, that's nothing. That's a landowner. But if you see that 8-foot high, sort of industrial looking fencing, maybe there's a wildlife crossing there. I mean, I'll say that, generally, this is still a technology or an approach that, you really see primarily in Western states, right? Colorado, where I live, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, these are the states with these big herds of migratory animals that are crossing highways in relatively predictable places and, therefore are fairly easy to build wildlife crossings for. By contrast, if you're driving around Pennsylvania or West Virginia or upstate New York where you are, Diana, you're just not going to see a whole lot of this stuff. These eastern states really haven't done very much on this issue. But that's changing, and I mean that wildlife crossings pilot program I mentioned earlier, that federal funding, that the first round of funding gave grants to Pennsylvania and Connecticut and South Dakota and a whole bunch of states that haven't traditionally worked on this issue. So I think the idea that this is a Western approach, I think that geographic divide is starting to break down. So for now, you're not going to see a whole lot of wildlife crossing infrastructure in the eastern U.S., but come back 10 years and hopefully it'll be ubiquitous.
Ben, thank you so much. Could you so you've written a book about beavers, you've written a book about wildlife crossings. Can you give us a sneak peek into what you're working on next?
Yeah, I'm writing a book about fish right now. A book
Fish.
about fish. Yeah, so in 2048, I'll be back on at the Sci-Fi Book Club. No, it's a book about I'd say it's a book about fish as, I mean, the way that I'm conceiving it, and this is me putting my beaver hat on maybe, but it's really a book about fish as keystone species and ecological and cultural engineers. These animals that we don't really think about very much oftentimes because of course they live underwater. They're not like migratory birds visiting the feeders in our backyards, and yet fish are sort of responsible for nutrient cycling and directing whale and bird migrations, and of course they're inextricably bound to human history and human culture, and so this this is a book about how fish sort of secretly run our planet, and why we're called to protect and restore them.
Well, I will bow down to the fish overlords
All right.
when they read your book and realize how
Thanks,
powerful
Diana.
they truly are. So, Ben, thank you so much. This has been so lovely. Thank you for writing Crossings, and thank you for agreeing to be our final book club of 2024. It was so nice to speak with you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm honored to have had Crossing selected, and thanks to everyone out there for reading and engaging with it. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks to our audience tonight for sending in their amazing questions. I mean, I was telling you, Ben, I rate good questions. They send in amazing questions. So thank you all for joining us today and for reading Crossings. If you've read it, and hopefully we've inspired you to pick up the book this holiday season. So this is almost the end of our book club for 2024. Next month, we are starting off 2025 by reading Fire Weather by John Valiant. And so really excited to dive into the way that fires have sort of changed our country and our world, and maybe the role of some of the economies around the world and kind of bringing upon this new sort of world that we live in. So I hope you'll join us for that book. Thank you all so much. As per usual, you can find all of our stuff on sciencefriday.com, and hopefully we will see you there for a future book. Ben, thank you again for joining, and we'll see you in 2025.
All right. Thanks, Diana.
Bye, everyone. See you next time.